Take a moment and picture this in your mind. A fragile, ancient manuscript, its pages browned by the centuries, covered in elegant, dark script that still looks sharp and clear. Have you ever paused to truly consider what you're looking at? It's not just the words that have survived, it's the very substance they are made of, that rich, black ink holding the thoughts of a monk, the edicts of a king, or the poetry of a long-lost culture. What is that stuff, really, and more importantly, how on earth did people centuries, even millennia ago, figure out how to make it? This isn't just a question for historians. It's a full-blown historical mystery, a fascinating puzzle that sits at the crossroads of chemistry, culture, and pure human ingenuity. The story of ink is the story of civilization itself. Without it, laws couldn't be written down to create order, stories couldn't be recorded to build culture, and knowledge couldn't be passed from one generation to the next. It was the lifeblood of progress, a simple yet profound technology that powered the entire engine of human history, and yet, its creation was often a deeply guarded secret, a kind of alchemy. We're about to go on a journey back through time, not to look at the great battles or the famous rulers, but to peer into the workshops and kitchens where this magical substance was born. We'll uncover the surprising ingredients people used, from the soot of their oil lamps to the galls of oak trees, and even the precious blood of sea creatures. This is a story of experimentation, of accident, and of brilliant discovery. It's a tale that reveals how our ancestors took the raw materials of their world and transformed them into a medium for thought, for faith, and for power. So get ready, because we are diving deep into the captivating world of historical ink making. And the secrets we uncover will change the way you see every old book, every ancient map, and every faded letter forever. Before ink, remembering was a monumental task, quite literally. Imagine a world where to make a record permanent, you had to physically carve it into something hard and durable, into clay tablets that could shatter, or into stone that took immense effort to shape. Every law, every treaty, every piece of important information had to be etched with a chisel. This was a technology of immense weight and permanence, but it was also agonizingly slow, incredibly difficult to reproduce, and nearly impossible to transport. A king's decree wasn't something you could copy and send to a distant province. It was a single, heavy object, fixed in one place. Knowledge was literally set in stone, and that meant it was static, localized, and accessible to only a very few. The very act of writing was a public, labor-intensive project, not a private moment of thought. Now, consider the revolutionary shift that occurred with the development of surfaces like papyrus in Egypt, or parchment made from animal skins. These materials were lightweight, flexible, and could be rolled up or bound into books. But this new technology was only half of the equation. You couldn't carve words into a sheet of papyrus. You needed a substance that could flow from a brush or a pen, a substance that could capture the speed of human thought and the curve of a scribe's hand. That substance was ink. This was the breakthrough that truly unlocked the potential of writing. Suddenly, the act of recording information was democratized. It became faster, more personal, and infinitely more portable. A single scribe could now produce a scroll in a fraction of the time it took a team of stonecutters to carve a single proclamation. This is why ink wasn't just an incremental improvement. It was a foundational technology for civilization, as transformative as the invention of the wheel or the control of fire. With ink, laws could be written down clearly and distributed across an empire, creating a unified legal system for the first time. Think of the Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest and most complete legal codes. It was inscribed on a stone stele, a towering public monument. But with ink, the Romans could write the 12 tables on bronze and, more importantly, copy them onto countless scrolls to be studied and enforced throughout their vast territories. Literature was no longer confined to the oral tradition of bards and poets, where stories changed with every telling. With ink, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the poetry of Homer, and the philosophy of Aristotle could be fixed in a permanent form, allowing ideas to be preserved, critiqued, and built upon by generations to come. Knowledge became cumulative. A discovery made in one generation didn't have to be rediscovered by the next. It could be written down, studied, and refined. This created a snowball effect for human progress. The administrative machinery of empires, from tax records to census data, ran on ink. The spread of religions was propelled by sacred texts that could be copied and carried across continents. Ink became the silent, indispensable partner to the written word, the fluid engine that powered the spread of laws, the preservation of culture, and the relentless, accelerating accumulation of human knowledge. It moved records from the realm of the monumental to the domain of the everyday, and in doing so, it fundamentally changed what humanity was capable of achieving. So where do we even begin to look for the origins of this transformative technology? We travel to the banks of the Nile, to the world of ancient Egypt, where the role of the scribe was among the most revered in society. These were the original masters of information, the bureaucrats and priests who wielded the power of the written word. And the substance that flowed from their rayed brushes was a sophisticated invention in its own right, a carefully formulated ink that has survived, remarkably legible, for over 4,000 years. Their primary writing surface was papyrus, a paper-like material made from the pith of the papyrus plant. But to mark upon it, they needed something that would adhere smoothly and last for eternity, just like their monuments. The solution they developed was both brilliantly simple and incredibly effective. For black ink, the most common color, the key ingredient was carbon black. This wasn't some mystical compound. It was essentially the fine, pure soot collected from the smoky flames of oil lamps or from burning resins. Think about that for a moment. The same soot that would blacken a cooking pot or a lamp's chimney was the very foundation of recorded knowledge. This carbon is chemically very stable and intensely black, and because it's carbon-based, it doesn't fade when exposed to light, which is a primary reason why those ancient Egyptian texts are still so crisp and readable today. But you can't just take soot and water and expect it to stick to a sheet of papyrus. It would be like trying to write with dust. It would smear and flake off at the slightest touch. This is where the ancient Egyptian ink makers showed their true ingenuity. They needed a binder, a glue to hold the pigment particles together and fix them permanently to the writing surface. Their binder of choice was gum arabic, a natural sap harvested from the acacia tree, which grew abundantly in the region. They would mix the carbon black powder with a little water and a solution of this gum arabic, creating a fluid, viscous ink that would flow beautifully from a brush and then dry to a durable, matte finish that was bonded to the papyrus fibers. It was a perfect marriage of readily available natural resources and practical chemistry, and their palette wasn't limited to just black. The Egyptians were famous for their use of vibrant color, and their inks reflected this. For headings, for highlighting important passages, and for specific ritual purposes, they used a vivid red ink. The pigment for this was red ochre, a type of iron oxide-rich clay that could be easily ground into a powder. This is the same material used to create the red hues in cave paintings, tens of thousands of years earlier. And here it was, being utilized in an advanced writing system. The fact that they had a standardized two-color ink system, black for the main body of text and red for emphasis, speaks to a highly developed and organized scribble tradition. We have breathtakingly beautiful evidence of this technology's longevity and success. Inside the pyramids at Saqqara, on the very walls of the burial chambers, we find the pyramid texts, some of the oldest religious writings in the world, inscribed in the 24th century before the Common Era. The hieroglyphs there were often painted on with these same types of inks. Later, on papyrus scrolls like the famous Book of the Dead, we can see the work of scribes in stunning detail. You can look at a papyrus from the New Kingdom, over 300 years old, and see the crisp, black hieroglyphs and the bold red rubrics as clearly as the day they were written. The scribe would typically carry his inks in a solid, dried form. He'd have a small cake of black ink and another of red, along with a dedicated water pot. When he sat down to work, he would dip his brush, rub it on the cake of ink, and begin his task. This dry cake form made the ink portable and long-lasting, a practical solution for a civilization that ran on meticulous record-keeping. The Egyptian ink recipe was so successful, so perfectly suited to its purpose, that it remained essentially unchanged for millennia. It's a testament to their mastery that they created a writing medium not just for their own time, but for the ages, allowing their stories, their prayers, and their knowledge to speak directly to us across the vast expanse of 40 centuries. The process of making this ink was an art form in itself, a quiet ritual performed before a single word was ever committed to papyrus. It began with the collection of the carbon black. This wasn't just about scraping any bit of soot from a lamp. The highest quality ink required a pure, fine, and intensely black pigment. Scribes or specialized craftsmen would use carefully controlled oil lamps, often burning specific oils or resins to produce a smoke that was particularly rich in carbon. They would hold a cool, smooth surface, like a ceramic plate or bowl, over the flame, allowing the soot to deposit in a fine, velvety layer. This method produced a pigment that was free from the grit and impurities you might find in a fireplace, resulting in an ink of exceptional smoothness and depth of color. Once collected, this precious soot was just the beginning. The scribe's most vital tool, aside from his brush, was his writing palette. These weren't simple slabs of wood or stone. They were often beautifully crafted objects, made of ivory, ebony, or fine wood, sometimes even taking the form of a deity or a symbolic animal. The palette featured two main depressions, one for the black ink cake and a smaller one for the red. Between them ran a long, shallow groove where the actual mixing would happen. When it was time to write, the scribe would take a small amount of the solid black cake, a compressed mixture of the soot and gum arabic, and place it in this groove. With a little water from his pot, he would then take a stone pestle and grind the mixture meticulously, working it into a smooth, liquid paste. This act of grinding was crucial. It wasn't just about adding water. It was about physically breaking down any remaining clumps and ensuring the pigment particles were perfectly suspended in the binder. The sound of that stone pestle on the palette groove was the sound of knowledge preparing to be born. And that binder, the gum arabic, was the unsung hero of the entire operation. Without it, the entire system would fail. Gum arabic is the hardened sap of the acacia tree, and when dissolved in water, it creates a sticky, viscous solution. In the ink, it served two essential purposes. First, it acted as a dispersant, coating each tiny particle of carbon black and preventing them from clumping together, which allowed the ink to flow smoothly and evenly from the scribe's rayed brush. Second, and more importantly, it was the adhesive. Once the ink was applied to the papyrus, the water would evaporate, and the gum arabic would dry into a thin, transparent film, physically gluing the pigment particles directly to the papyrus fibers. This is what gave Egyptian ink its legendary durability. It didn't just sit on the surface, it became part of it, bonded so effectively that it could survive thousands of years in a dry climate without flaking, smudging, or fading. You can see this incredible adhesion in surviving artifacts. On a papyrus scroll, the ink has a slight sheen, a subtle gloss that comes from that gum arabic film. Even when a sheet of papyrus becomes brittle and fragile with age, the ink itself remains firmly in place, the words as sharp and defined as the day they were written. This meticulous process, from the careful collection of soot to the final grinding on the palette, transformed simple, earthly materials into a medium for eternity. It was a technology of permanence, perfected by a civilization that was profoundly focused on leaving a lasting record of their world for the gods and for the future. While the Egyptians perfected their carbon-based inks, a very different, almost alchemical recipe was quietly brewing in the ancient world, one that would eventually conquer Europe and dominate writing for more than 1,000 years. This was iron gall ink, and its invention was a revolution in a bottle. Unlike the simple soot and glue formula of the Egyptians, iron gall ink was a dynamic, living chemistry. Its creation relied on a fascinating interaction between two seemingly ordinary ingredients that, when combined, underwent a visible transformation. The first component was iron. Scribes didn't need pure metal. They used what was readily available: rusty nails, old iron tools, or even a substance known as green vitriol, which is iron sulfate. This provided the essential iron salts. The second, equally crucial ingredient came not from a smithy, but from an oak tree. Specifically, it came from oak galls, also known as gall nuts. These aren't fruits or nuts in the traditional sense. They are actually abnormal growths, like swollen, woody tumors that form on oak trees when a certain species of gall wasp lays its eggs in the tree's buds. The tree, in an attempt to defend itself, encases the irritant in a hard, round shell that is incredibly rich in tannic acid. It was this tannic acid that held the key. The process of making the ink was almost like a kitchen recipe, but one with a magical reveal. A scribe or an ink maker would first crush these oak galls into a coarse powder and steep them in water, almost like making a strong, bitter tea. This extracted the tannic acid, creating a light brown, tannin-rich solution. Separately, they would take their source of iron, let's say a handful of rusty nails, and let them sit in vinegar to dissolve and create a solution of iron salts. Then came the moment of magic. When the two solutions were combined, something remarkable happened. The clear, light brown tannin tea would instantly react with the iron solution, turning a deep, inkai blue-black or purple-black right before the maker's eyes. This wasn't just a simple mixing of colors. It was a chemical reaction, the formation of a new compound called iron galatanate. Initially, the ink might appear a faint gray or pale purple, but as it was exposed to the oxygen in the air on the writing surface, it would darken dramatically over hours or days, settling into that intense, lasting black we see on old manuscripts. This characteristic was part of its genius. You could see your writing as you put it down, but its full, permanent power emerged only with time. This permanence was iron gall ink's crowning glory. Once the iron galatanate pigment formed and bonded with the fibers of parchment or paper, It became incredibly resistant to fading, water, and even deliberate washing. You couldn't simply wipe it away as you might with a carbon-based ink. This made it the undisputed choice for documents of supreme importance, legal charters, royal decrees, property deeds, and religious texts. Its durability was a guarantee of authenticity. If you had a treaty written in iron gall ink, you could be confident that its words would not easily be altered or erased by a forger. This permanence, however, came with a hidden, destructive secret. The chemical reaction that created the dark pigment didn't stop when the ink dried. Over centuries, the residual acid from the tannins and the ongoing oxidation process could literally eat through the page. This is why we see so many historical documents, like the stunning manuscripts of the Middle Ages, or even some of Leonardo da Vinci's notebooks, with what conservators call ink burn or haloing, where the ink has corroded the parchment, leaving brittle brown burned areas around the writing, and sometimes even creating holes where the letters once were. The very substance that guaranteed the survival of the words could also, paradoxically, destroy the page that held them. Despite this flaw, iron gall ink's advantages were so profound that it became the standard writing fluid across Europe from the fall of the Roman Empire straight through to the 19th century. It was the ink used by monks to illuminate breathtaking Bibles, by clerks to record the proceedings of courts, and by explorers to map the New World. Its recipe was so fundamental that it appears in countless medieval instructional manuals, a testament to its central role in the written culture of an entire continent. Now, let's step into the shoes of a medieval scribe and see exactly how this remarkable ink was concocted. The recipe was often passed down through generations, a blend of practical skill and what must have seemed like pure magic. It all started with a walk through an oak forest, but you weren't just looking for acorns. You were hunting for oak galls, those strange, marble-like growths on the branches. The best ones were known as Aleppo galls, named for a region famous for their quality, but any oak tree might offer a harvest. The trick was to collect them after the wasp larva inside had matured and left, but before the gall itself had deteriorated. A perfectly timed harvest ensured the highest concentration of tannic acid. Once gathered, the hard, woody galls were crushed. This wasn't a gentle process. Using a mortar and pestle, the scribe would break them down into a coarse powder, releasing their bitter, astringent scent. This powder was then placed into a ceramic jar or a glass vessel. Next came the liquid for extraction. While water worked perfectly well, many recipes called for something stronger, wine, and specifically white wine was often preferred. The acidity in the wine helped to draw out even more tannin from the crushed galls, creating a more potent brew. You would pour the wine over the gall powder, creating a muddy, brown slurry. This mixture was then left to steep, sometimes for several days, and it required daily stirring. Imagine a monk in a quiet scriptorium, patiently tending to his jar of what looked like murky water, knowing that inside, the essential chemical precursor to his ink was slowly leaching out. After this patient steeping, the liquid was carefully strained through a cloth to remove all the solid fragments of the gall, leaving behind a clear, strong, dark brown tannin solution. Now for the second act of this chemical drama, introducing the iron. The most common source was a substance known as green vitriol or iron sulfate. This could be purchased from an apothecary, or a resourceful person might even make their own by leaving iron nails to rust in vinegar, then evaporating the liquid to collect the crystalline salts. This green vitriol was added to the strained tannin tea, and this is where the true alchemy happened. As the iron sulfate dissolved into the liquid, the clear brown solution would undergo a dramatic transformation, darkening instantly to a deep purplish black. It was a moment of revelation, as if turning water into wine. The ink was now chemically active, but the process wasn't quite finished. To this newly formed ink, the scribe would almost always add one final ingredient, gum arabic. Just as the ancient Egyptians had discovered, this natural sap acted as a crucial binder. It gave the ink the right viscosity so it would flow smoothly from a quill pen without bleeding excessively into the parchment. More importantly, it helped suspend the newly formed iron galatinate particles evenly throughout the liquid, preventing them from settling as sludge at the bottom of the ink pot. And it helped the ink adhere properly to the writing surface. The final mixture was then left to mature for a short time, allowing the chemical reaction to stabilize. What you had in the end was a living, breathing ink. When first applied to parchment with a quill, it might go down looking a pale gray or a dull purple, but as it dried and oxidized in the air, the writing would gradually darken over hours or even days, deepening into that classic, uncompromising black that was the hallmark of a permanent record. This wasn't just a recipe, it was a rite. It connected the scribe to the natural world, the oak tree, the wasp, the iron from the earth, and through a simple but profound chemical process, transformed these humble ingredients into the very substance of memory itself. So let's pull one of those ingredients out of the mixture and place it under a magnifying glass. We need to talk about the oak gall itself, because this isn't just some random nut or berry you could pick up off the forest floor. An oak gall is a botanical anomaly, a perfect little factory for ink created by a fascinating, and frankly, a bit brutal partnership between a plant and an insect. Here's how it happens. A tiny female gall wasp, of which there are hundreds of species, seeks out a specific type of oak tree. She doesn't want to eat the leaves or the bark. She has a much more precise mission. Using a specialized organ called an ovipositor, she carefully injects a single egg, along with a cocktail of her own chemicals, directly into the soft, growing tissue of an oak bud, or sometimes a leaf vein or even an acorn. This injection is the trigger. The tree, sensing this foreign intrusion and the chemical signature of the wasp, doesn't just attack it. Instead, it mounts a defensive response, a kind of controlled cellular panic. The plant's own hormones go into overdrive, causing the cells around the egg to rapidly multiply and swell, forming a hard, protective shell that completely encases the developing wasp larva. Think of it as the tree building a secure, nutrient-rich prison for its tiny invader. And that's exactly what it is. The gall provides the developing grub with both shelter and a constant food source, as it feeds on the concentrated sap and starches inside this self-contained pot. But here's the crucial part for our ink makers. This intense biological reaction also causes an immense concentration of tannic acid within the gall's tissues. Tannins are a class of bitter, astringent compounds that plants produce as a natural defense against herbivores and pests. In a normal leaf, the tannin level is relatively low. But inside a gall, where the tree is mustering its full defensive resources to wall off the invader, the tannin concentration skyrockets, sometimes making up over half of the gall's dry weight. It's this incredibly potent dose of tannic acid that makes the oak gall the undisputed champion for ink making. The trapped larva, living in this intensely tannin-rich environment, is somehow immune to its effects, slowly growing and developing until it finally chews its way out as an adult wasp, leaving behind a small, empty exit hole. For the scribe, Finding a gall with this hole was the sign of a perfect harvest. It meant the larva was gone, the internal structure was intact, and the tannic acid was at its peak potency, ready to be unlocked. Not all galls were considered equal, however. Medieval ink makers and apothecaries had their preferences, often detailed in their recipe books. The most highly prized were the so-called Aleppo galls, named for the region around modern-day Syria. These were large, round, and heavy for their size, and were renowned for producing an ink of exceptional darkness and durability. Other types, like the smaller, more irregular oak apples, could also be used, but they often resulted in a lighter, browner ink. The timing of the harvest was a delicate art. If you collected the galls too early, while the larva was still inside and actively feeding, the tannin content might not have fully developed. If you waited too long after the wasp had emerged, the gall could become brittle, dusty, and riddled with fungi, its precious tannins degraded by exposure and decay. The ideal gall was firm, heavy, and showed that single, clean exit hole. Once gathered, these ink pods were often dried in the sun to preserve them, turning into hard, woody spheres that could be stored for years, a scribe's insurance policy against a future shortage. When it was time to make a new batch of ink, these little time capsules of tannin would be cracked open and crushed, releasing all that stored chemical potential, ready to meet its partner, the iron, and begin the magical transformation into the fluid of history. But while the oak gall provided the crucial tannic acid, it was powerless without its metallic partner. On its own, the brown gall solution was just a weak stain. It needed iron to transform into that deep, permanent black, and the key to unlocking this reaction was a specific compound known as green vitriol. The name itself sounds like something from a wizard's cupboard, and in a way it was. Green vitriol is the historical name for iron sulfate, a crystalline salt that forms as a result of a fascinating geological process. One of the most common ways it occurred naturally was through the weathering of a mineral known as pyrite, often called fool's gold. When pyrite, which is iron disulfide, is exposed to air and moisture, it begins to oxidize, slowly breaking down and producing, among other things, sulfate ions and iron ions. Over time, these would combine and crystallize into those distinctive greenish-blue crystals of iron sulfate. Early ink makers learned to recognize these deposits, sometimes collecting them from the walls of old mines or from areas where pyrite-rich rock was crumbling away. But as demand grew, a more systematic production method emerged. Artisans would actually create piles of pyrite ore, deliberately exposing it to the elements and periodically watering it to accelerate the oxidation process. They would then collect the resulting crystals that formed on the surface, a slow but effective way to farm this essential ingredient. For the average scribe or monastery, however, obtaining green vitriol was often a matter of a visit to the local apothecary. These shops were the chemical supply houses of the medieval world, and they would stock vitriol that had been purified through a process of dissolution and recrystallization. This step of purification was not merely about creating a better-looking product. It was absolutely critical to the quality and safety of the final ink. Raw, unrefined green vitriol could contain a host of other metallic impurities, such as copper or even traces of arsenic, depending on the source rock. These contaminants could interfere with the chemical reaction, resulting in an ink that was a dull brown instead of a rich black, or worse, one that was unpredictably corrosive. The presence of excess sulfuric acid, a byproduct of the pyrite weathering process, was another major concern. An ink made with impure vitriol could be far too acidic. While a certain level of acidity was necessary for the chemical reaction to proceed, an excessive amount would accelerate the dreaded ink burn, that corrosive process where the acid literally eats through the parchment or paper over the centuries. A master ink maker, therefore, knew that the purity of his green vitriol was non-negotiable. He would look for crystals that were a clear, bright greenish white, free from a yellow or brown tinge that might signal contamination. He might even test a small sample before committing it to a full batch, ensuring that his precious documents would be marked with an ink of lasting beauty, not one that would ultimately destroy the very page it was meant to adorn. This careful attention to the metallic heart of the ink was what separated a serviceable writing fluid from a legendary one, capable of carrying words across the bridge of time. This remarkable permanence that made iron gall ink the trusted medium for Europe's most important documents concealed a slow-acting, destructive force. The very chemical reaction that gifted the ink its deep, lasting blackness also sowed the seeds of its own decay. The problem lies in the excess acidity. Remember, the ink is a mixture of tannic acid from the oak galls and iron salts, often dissolved in an already acidic medium like wine or vinegar. While this acidity is necessary to drive the initial reaction, it doesn't just vanish once the ink dries. A significant amount of free acid remains trapped within the written lines, and over time, it begins a relentless, invisible campaign against the parchment or paper itself. Parchment, being made from animal skin, is primarily composed of collagen, a protein that is highly susceptible to acid. Paper, made from plant fibers like linen or cotton, is based on cellulose, which is also vulnerable to acidic degradation. The lingering acid in the ink acts as a catalyst, breaking the long, strong molecular chains of these materials. It's a process of slow-motion combustion, a chemical fire that doesn't need flame. The first visible sign is often a phenomenon conservators call ink burn or haloing. You see a beautiful, centuries-old manuscript, and around the dark lettering, the parchment has turned a brittle, translucent brown. This browning is the direct result of the acid migrating out from the ink line and weakening the surrounding fibers, making them fragile and discolored. In the most severe cases, the degradation doesn't stop at discoloration. The acid continues its work until the structural integrity of the page is completely compromised. The parchment or paper becomes so weak that it simply crumbles away, leaving behind literal holes in the historical record. The writing doesn't just fade, it actively consumes the surface it was meant to adorn, vanishing into a latticework of empty space. Some of the most heartbreaking and famous examples of this come from the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci. He filled thousands of pages with his mirror writing, detailing his revolutionary ideas for flying machines, anatomy, and hydraulics, all using the standard iron gall ink of his day. Today, conservators handle these priceless folios with immense care, because in many places, the corrosive ink has burned completely through the paper. You can look at a drawing of an intricate gear system or a delicate human heart and sea gaps where the lines have simply eaten themselves away, leaving the meaning fragmented and, in some cases, permanently lost. This creates a profound historical mystery. We have these brilliant works, but we are left to puzzle over the missing pieces, to wonder what other genius insight was captured in the lines that have now vanished into dust. This isn't an isolated problem. Countless medieval charters, musical scores, and personal letters suffer from the same fate. The ink that was chosen specifically for its permanence has, in a terrible irony, become an agent of destruction. This presents an immense and urgent challenge for modern conservators, who are essentially historical doctors fighting a biochemical battle. Their goal is to stabilize these documents and halt the corrosion before more information is lost forever. One of the most critical and delicate procedures is known as deacidification. This involves carefully washing the fragile page or applying a mild alkaline solution to neutralize the residual acid trapped within it. Imagine the painstaking work of immersing a 500-year-old, crumbling piece of parchment in a special bath, knowing that one wrong move could erase the very history you're trying to save. It's a high-stakes operation. Furthermore, conservators now use advanced imaging technologies to recover lost text. Multispectral imaging, for instance, can photograph a document under different wavelengths of light, sometimes revealing the ghostly impression of letters in the damaged areas where the ink itself is gone, but where a chemical change or a slight staining in the substrate still betrays the original writing. This is detective work at the molecular level, a race against time to decipher the words that iron Gall ink both preserved and condemned to a slow disappearance. The story of this ink, therefore, is a double-edged sword. It gave us the legal frameworks, the literary masterpieces, and the scientific revelations that built the modern world, yet it carried within its formula a hidden timer, a reminder that even our most durable creations are engaged in a constant, fragile dance with time. While iron Gall ink provided the stark, permanent text, the pages of the most luxurious medieval manuscripts tell a far more colorful story. Open a book like the Tres Riches Hures du Ducteberry or the Book of Kells, and you are immediately transported into a world of radiant blues, blazing reds, and shimmering gold that seems to capture light itself. These were not mere decorations. They were visual theology, status symbols, and technical marvels, all powered by an astonishing palette of pigments sourced from the furthest corners of the known world. For the monks and artisans working in cold, dimly lit scriptoria, creating these illuminations was a sacred act, and they employed materials as precious as jewels to honor the divine word. The most revered of all these colors was a blue of such depth and intensity that it seemed to hold a piece of the heavens. This was ultramarine, and its name literally means beyond the sea. It was painstakingly made from the semi-precious stone lapis lazuli, which for centuries could only be mined in a single, remote region in the mountains of modern-day Afghanistan. Just imagine the journey. The rough, blue-flecked stones were transported by camel caravans across deserts and deserts, then shipped on vessels across the Mediterranean, passing through countless hands before finally reaching the workshops of Europe. This immense journey made ultramarine, weight for weight, more expensive than gold. The process of turning the hard stone into a fine, usable pigment was a masterpiece of patience and skill. First, the lapis lazuli was carefully sorted to select the pieces with the richest, deepest blue color, free from white calcite or golden pyrite inclusions. These chosen pieces were then ground into a coarse powder, but this powder wasn't ready to paint with. It contained a mixture of the prized blue mineral lazurite and unwanted rocky impurities. To separate them, artisans used a delicate washing process. The ground powder was mixed with a paste of pine resin, beeswax, and linseed oil. This sticky mass was then repeatedly kneaded and submerged in a weak lye solution. As they worked the paste, the incredibly fine, valuable blue particles of lazurite would be released and sink to the bottom, while the heavier, worthless gray rock powder remained trapped in the wax. This laborious washing could be repeated a dozen times or more to extract every last bit of the perfect blue. Because of its supreme cost and beauty, ultramarine was reserved for the most important figures in a manuscript: the robes of the Virgin Mary, the canopy of heaven, or the borders that framed sacred scenes. Its application was an act of devotion in itself, a way of using the most precious material on earth to illuminate the most sacred truths. If ultramarine was the color of the celestial, then vermilion was the color of earthly power, sacred blood, and dramatic emphasis. This brilliant, opaque red was derived from cinnabar, a mercuric sulfide mineral that occurs as a striking scarlet crystalline rock. Mined in places like Spain and Slovenia, cinnabar could be ground directly to produce a potent red pigment. However, medieval artisans discovered they could create an even more vibrant version through a startling alchemical process. They would actually combine liquid mercury and molten sulfur in a sealed pot. When heated, these two elements would violently react to form a black, crystalline mass of synthetic cinnabar. This mass was then ground and heated again, transforming from black to the characteristic fiery red vermilion. Knowing what we do now about the toxicity of mercury, the very act of making this pigment was hazardous. Yet the resulting color was so stunningly vivid and permanent that the risk was deemed worth it. Scribes used vermilion for the large, decorated initial letters that began chapters, to highlight key words in a text, and to paint the blood of martyrs and the robes of saints. It provided a visual shock on the page, a burst of energy that commanded the reader's attention and underscored the intensity of the narrative. In many ways, the partnership of deep black iron Gall ink, celestial ultramarine blue, and fiery vermilion red formed the essential color trinity of the medieval illuminated page. But no material conveyed wealth, divinity, and pure, radiant light more than gold itself. The application of gold leaf in manuscripts was one of the most specialized and breathtaking skills in the entire process. This wasn't paint. It was the thinnest possible sheet of real gold, hammered so fine that a single gram could cover an area larger than a modern sheet of printer paper. To make this gold stick to the parchment, the artisan first had to prepare the surface with a raised, smooth foundation called a mordant. This was often made from a mixture of gypsum, chalk, or clay bound with glue, and it was carefully painted on in the shapes where the gold was to appear. Once this base was almost dry but still slightly tacky, the illuminator would breathe gently on it to reactivate the glue. Then, using a fine brush or a pair of tweezers, they would lift a fragile sheet of gold leaf and lay it over the prepared area. They would then gently press it down with a pad of cotton or a soft tool, often a polished animal tooth like a wolf's or a bear's, which was used to burnish the gold to a mirror-like shine. The effect was transformative. This solid gold didn't just reflect light. It seemed to generate it from within the page, glowing in the flickering candlelight of a chapel. This technique, known as shell gold, when the gold was sometimes ground into a powder and mixed with a binder for finer details, created a divine radiance that lifted the illustrations right off the page. The gold-leafed backgrounds of holy figures symbolized the immutable light of heaven, making the manuscript not just a book to be read, but a sacred object to be experienced, a portable window into a world of divine splendor. To understand just how precious this blue truly was, we need to trace it all the way back to its source, a journey that begins in one of the most formidable and isolated landscapes on Earth. Nestled deep within the Hindu Kush Mountains of modern-day Afghanistan, in a region known as Badakhshan, lie the legendary Sar Isang mines. For over 6,000 years, in a near-continuous operation, people have been tunneling into these stark, arid mountains to extract a single, extraordinary stone, lapis lazuli. The mining conditions were, and in many ways still are, incredibly harsh. Miners worked at high altitudes, in narrow, unstable tunnels dug with simple tools, often by the dim light of oil lamps. They were seeking veins of a rock that is unmistakable, a deep midnight blue, speckled with brilliant, dust-like flecks of golden pyrite that shimmer like distant stars. This striking appearance led ancient cultures to believe the stone was a fragment of the starry night sky, a piece of heaven brought down to earth. The value of this material was recognized from the very beginning. Long before it reached European monasteries, lapis was being traded across the ancient world. Archaeologists have found lapis lazuli beads in Neolithic burial sites dating back to the 7th millennium before the Common Era, and it was highly prized by the Sumerians, Egyptians, and Persians, who used it for jewelry, amulets, and inlays for magnificent artifacts like the Mask of Tutankhamun. The journey from the Afghan mines to the outside world was an epic feat of logistics and endurance. The rough stones were transported by donkey and camel caravans along what would later become formalized segments of the Silk Road. They traveled northwest through Persia, then west to the great port cities of the Mediterranean like Alexandria. From there, Venetian and Genoese merchant ships carried this blue gold across the sea to Europe. Every hand it passed through, the miner, the caravan driver, the merchant, the ship's captain added to its ultimate cost. By the time a small, wrapped parcel of raw lapis lazuli finally arrived at the gates of a European monastery, its value was quite literally incomparable. It was a commodity more expensive, ounce for ounce, than the purest gold, a fact recorded in countless account books and contracts from the time. This immense cost meant that its use was never casual. It was an investment in divine glory. The process of transforming this rough, beautiful stone into the sublime pigment known as ultramarine was a further test of patience and skill, a secretive art often passed down within monastic communities or specialized guilds. The first step was to select the very best pieces of raw lapis. The artisans would carefully inspect their precious stones, rejecting any that had too many white calcite veins or large, intrusive chunks of pyrite. They sought out the pieces with the most intense, uniform blue color. These chosen stones were then meticulously ground using a mortar and pestle. This wasn't a rushed process. Grinding too vigorously could produce a coarse, gritty powder that was useless for the delicate work of illumination. The goal was to create an extremely fine, consistent powder. But this ground powder was still a mixture. It contained the prized blue mineral lazurite, along with those unwanted white and gray rocky impurities. Simply mixing this crude powder with a binder would yield a pale, dull, and grayish-blue paint, a tragic waste of such a valuable material. To isolate the pure, radiant blue, artisans employed a remarkably clever and laborious washing technique known as the pacello method. The ground lapis powder was mixed into a paste made from pine resin, beeswax, and linseed oil. This sticky, pliable mass was then repeatedly kneaded by hand in a bowl containing a weak alkaline solution, often made from lye or wood ash. Here's the magical part. As the artisan worked the paste in the liquid, the heavy, worthless rock particles would remain trapped within the waxy resin. The finest, most vibrant blue particles of lazurite, however, would be released from the paste and slowly sink to the bottom of the bowl as a sediment of stunningly pure color. The first washing would yield the highest grade of ultramarine, a deep, vibrant blue of unparalleled quality. The paste would then be kneaded again in a fresh bath of lye water, releasing a second, slightly less intense blue, and this process might be repeated up to 10 or 12 times, with each successive washing producing a lower, paler grade of the pigment. The very finest grade from that first separation was what the master illuminators reserved for their most important task, painting the robes of the Virgin Mary. This association was both doctrinal and deeply symbolic. In medieval theology, blue was the color of heaven, of truth, and of humility. By clothing the Mother of God in a robe made from the most precious substance on earth, artists were making a powerful visual statement about her celestial status and the unparalleled reverence due to her. The cost of the material reflected her spiritual value. Using ultramarine was an act of devotion, a way for a wealthy patron or a whole monastery to demonstrate their piety through the most extravagant means possible. When you look at a 15th century painting of the Madonna and see that particular, profound blue that seems to have an inner light, you are not just looking at a color. You are looking at the culmination of an epic journey from a remote mountain mine, the pinnacle of medieval alchemical skill, and a profound expression of faith that literally valued the divine in worth beyond gold. While Europe was mastering the chemistry of iron and oak galls, a completely different yet equally profound ink-making tradition was reaching its zenith on the other side of the world. In the sophisticated artistic cultures of China and later Japan, ink was not just a utility. It was the soul of the artist's expression, the very breath of calligraphy and painting. This tradition gave us what is commonly known today as India ink, a name that reflects its trade routes rather than its origin, and in Japan, the sublime art of sumi. Unlike the liquid, ready-to-use inks of the West, the Asian approach was one of intentional preparation and profound connection to the moment of creation. At the heart of this process was a simple yet perfect combination: the purest carbon black, known as lamp black, and a powerful binder derived from animal sources. The creation of lamp black was a patient and smoky art. In dedicated workshops, artisans would burn specific materials rich in resin and oil, with pine wood being a particularly prized fuel in China. They would arrange dozens of small, oil-filled lamps in a confined, sheltered space, often with a ceramic lid or a cool, smooth surface suspended above the flames. As the lamps burned, a thick, velvety smoke would rise, and the finest, purest particles of soot would gently deposit on the cool surface. This wasn't the gritty soot from a fireplace. It was an extremely fine, intensely black carbon powder, collected with immense care over many hours. This lamp black was the essential pigment, prized for its deep, matte blackness and its incredible stability over time. It would not fade, nor would it corrode the delicate paper it adorned. But just like the Egyptian scribes millennia before them, Asian ink makers faced the same fundamental challenge: how to make this dry, dusty powder stick. Their brilliant solution was animal glue, typically made by boiling down animal hides, bones, or cartilage to extract collagen. This created a strong, flexible protein-based adhesive. The lamp black was meticulously mixed with a liquid solution of this animal glue, along with other potential additives like aromatic musk or camphor to prevent mildew and impart a pleasant scent, creating a thick black dough. This dough was then pressed into wooden molds, often carved with beautiful characters or patterns signifying the workshop's name or the ink's quality, and left to slowly dry and harden into a solid, lustrous black stick or cake. This was the form in which ink was sold and treasured not as a liquid in a pot, but as a solid object of art, a tangible piece of potential. The very use of this ink was a meditative ritual that began every act of calligraphy or painting. An artist would start by pouring a small amount of fresh water onto a finely carved stone slab known as an inkstone. This stone surface was slightly abrasive. Then, holding the solid ink stick vertically, the artist would begin to grind it, moving it in a slow, deliberate, circular motion on the moistened stone. With every pass, a tiny amount of the ink stick would dissolve, releasing the lampblack and animal glue into the water, creating a fluid ink right there on the stone's well. This was not a rushed process. The speed and pressure of the grinding determined the ink's consistency and density. A calligrapher seeking a deep, bold line for a powerful character would grind longer and with more pressure, creating a thick, tar-like ink. A painter needing a soft, ethereal wash for a distant mountain peak would grind lightly and briefly, producing a pale, translucent gray. This act of grinding was far more than mere preparation. It was a time for the artist to calm their mind, focus their intention, and become one with the tool and the medium. It connected the physical act of creation directly to the mental state of the creator. The inkstone itself became a cherished personal object, often passed down through generations, its surface worn into a gentle concavity by years of dedicated use. This entire system, from the solid stick to the grinding ritual, was perfectly suited to the demands of the brush. The animal glue binder gave the ink a unique property. It was water-resistant once it dried. A stroke painted onto absorbent paper or silk would stay crisp and sharp, without bleeding or feathering at the edges, allowing for the incredible precision and expressive line work that defines Asian calligraphy. The artist could control the thirst of the brush, loading it with a watery gray or a dense black, and create an entire universe of tone and texture with a single prepared ink. This was not a formula for record-keeping or legal documents. It was a medium designed for the highest forms of artistic and spiritual expression, a testament to a culture that saw the act of writing and painting as a pathway to inner harmony and a connection with the fundamental nature of the world. In the world of Japanese art, the humble ink stick is far more than just a tool. It is a vessel for an entire philosophy. This tradition, known as sumi, or ink wash painting, elevates the act of making and using ink to a spiritual discipline, a form of moving meditation where the journey is as important as the destination. While the core ingredients of sumi ink are the same as the Chinese stick ink lampblack and animal glue, the Japanese approach infused the process with the profound principles of Zen Buddhism. The goal of a sumi artist was never to create a photorealistic copy of the world, but to capture its essential spirit, its kokoro. A single, deftly placed brushstroke could suggest the rugged slope of a mountain, the delicate curve of a bamboo leaf bending in the wind, or the solitary stillness of a bird on a branch. The entire universe of expression was contained within a spectrum of black, gray, and the white of the paper itself, which was not seen as empty space, but as an active, breathing element of the composition. This artistic philosophy demanded an ink of unparalleled subtlety and responsiveness, and that began long before the brush ever touched the paper. The ritual starts with the artist's state of mind. Before even setting out the tools, the painter seeks a state of calm, focused readiness, clearing away mental clutter to become a clear channel for the creative act. The first physical step is the preparation of the suzuri, the inkstone. This is not a mere slab. It is a carefully crafted object, often made of fine slate or pottery, with a flat grinding surface and a lower reservoir or well to hold the prepared ink. The quality of the stone's surface is critical. It must be fine-grained and perfectly smooth to grind the ink to a silky consistency without introducing grit. Next comes the water. In the sumi tradition, the water is not just a solvent. It is the lifeblood of the ink, and its purity is paramount. Artists would traditionally use fresh, clean rainwater or water from a pure spring, never stagnant or tap water that might contain minerals or impurities that could cloud the ink's transparency or alter its behavior on the paper. This pure water is poured sparingly into the well of the inkstone. Now, the heart of the ritual begins, the grinding of the sumi, the ink stick. The artist holds the stick perfectly vertical, and with a calm, steady pressure, begins to move it in slow, deliberate, clockwise circles on the moistened grinding surface. There is no rushing this. The process might take 10, 15, or even 20 minutes. This is not wasted time. It is the core of the meditation. The rhythmic, circular motion, the soft, soothing sound of stone against ink, the gradual darkening of the water, all of it serves to synchronize the artist's breath, heart, and intention. The mind settles, distractions fall away, and the painter becomes fully present in the moment, mentally rehearsing the image that is about to be born. This grinding technique is also a precise science that directly controls the artistic outcome. The speed, pressure, and duration of grinding determine the ink's density and character. A heavy, slow grind for a long time produces jaboku, a thick, deep, and glossy jet black ink. This is the ink of strong, defining lines, of the dark shadows at the base of a cliff, of the bold characters in a piece of calligraphy. It is opaque and powerful, sitting on the surface of the paper with weight and authority. Conversely, a lighter, quicker grind creates a range of translucent grays known collectively as boku. By varying the amount of water and the intensity of grinding, the artist can create an entire gradient of tones, from a medium gray to the most ethereal, mist-like wash. To achieve the subtlest shades, the artist might even lift a brush charged with clear water and touch it to the edge of the dense black ink in the well, pulling out just a whisper of pigment. This mastery of tone is what gives sumi its breathtaking depth and atmosphere. An artist painting a landscape does not use different colors to show distance. They use different dilutions of the same ink. The foreground elements are painted with the darkest, richest black, making them appear close and solid. The middle ground might be rendered in a middle gray, and the faraway mountains are suggested by the faintest gray wash, seeming to recede in the haze. The white of the untouched paper might become a waterfall, a cloud, or the reflective surface of a lake. This controlled layering of value creates a profound sense of space and dimension, all from a single pigment. The final stroke, applied with a swift, confident certainty that comes from a tranquil mind, is irreversible. There is no going back, no painting over a mistake. In sumi, the acceptance of the mark as it is, a little bleeding here, an unexpected dry brush effect there, is part of the philosophy. It embraces the beauty of imperfection, wabi sabi, finding the unique character and life in the accidental. The resulting painting is not just a picture. It is a frozen moment of the artist's concentrated spirit, a visual poem written in the infinite shades between light and dark. Now, think about the substance we've been exploring, these complex, carefully crafted inks. But an ink is nothing without the instrument that delivers it to the page. The tool in the scribe's hand was as crucial as the recipe in his pot, and its shape, its very nature, fundamentally directed the style of writing, the speed of work, and even the posture of the writer. Across different cultures, we see a fascinating divergence in this technology. a direct response to the materials available and the visual language each civilization valued. In ancient Egypt, the primary tool was the reed pen. This wasn't just a piece of straw picked up from the riverbank. It was a precision instrument, meticulously fashioned from the sturdy stem of a reed like the bamboo reed or the giant reed. A scribe would select a mature stalk, one with a solid, tubular structure, and cut it to a comfortable length, about the same as a modern pencil. The real artistry came in shaping the tip. Using a small, sharp knife, the scribe would carve a narrow slit up into the end of the reed, creating two flexible tines, and then he would carefully cut the very tip of these tines at a sharp angle to form a point. This created a nib that was firm yet had a slight spring. This design was perfectly matched to the ink it carried. The Egyptian carbon and gum ink was quite thick and needed a tool that could hold a small reservoir of it. The reed pen's slit acted like a capillary channel, drawing the ink down and allowing it to flow steadily as the scribe pressed the tip to the papyrus. The resulting stroke was clean and uniform, ideal for the precise, structured shapes of hieroglyphic and hieratic script. The scribe wrote primarily on a scroll held in his lap or on a tablet propped on his knee, and the reed pen was held almost vertically, pushed across the surface to form the characters. It was a tool for clarity and efficiency, perfectly suited to the administrative and religious texts that were the lifeblood of Egyptian bureaucracy. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, the sound of writing was the soft scratch of a quill pen on parchment. This was an entirely different technology, born from the countryside and the changing seasons. The quill was made from the primary flight feather of a large bird, most commonly a goose. Why a goose? Its feathers were the ideal size, strong yet flexible, and readily available on any farm. But the feather couldn't be used straight from the bird. It first had to be cured. A fresh feather is floppy and filled with a greasy, organic pith that would rot and spoil the ink. So scribes would harden the barrels by gently heating them in hot sand or ashes. This process drove out the oils, made the shaft translucent and hard, and gave it a pleasant golden brown color. Then, with a special knife called a penna or a penknife, the scribe would begin the delicate operation of cutting the nib. This was a skill that took years to master. The scribe would first cut the end of the quill at a steep diagonal, then carve a narrow slit up the center to create an ink channel. The most critical part was shaping the two sides of the tip into a flat, chisel-like point. This specific shape is the reason for the characteristic thick and thin strokes of European calligraphy. When held at a consistent angle, the broad edge of the nib would produce a wide, heavy downstroke as pressure was applied, and the sharp corner would create a fine, hairline upstroke as the pen was lifted. This dynamic line variation gave scripts like Carolingian minuscule and Gothic textura their rhythmic, textured beauty, a visual music played out in ink. A quill was a delicate instrument, however. The organic material would wear down quickly against the slightly abrasive surface of parchment. A busy scribe might have to recut his nib several times a day, which is why every scribe's toolkit featured a sharp knife as his constant companion. The quill also demanded a specific writing posture. Parchment was typically placed on a sloped desk, and the scribe held the quill at a much lower, flatter angle than the Egyptian reed pen, almost parallel to the page. This allowed the broad nib to glide smoothly, harnessing its full calligraphic potential. The quill and iron gall ink were a perfect, if demanding, partnership that defined the look of Western writing for 1,000 years. In Asia, the philosophy of writing was entirely different, and so was the tool. Here, the instrument of choice was not a pen at all, but the brush. Unlike the rigid point of a reed or a quill, the Chinese and Japanese brush was an object of incredible softness and flexibility, designed not for pushing or scratching, but for dancing. A traditional brush is a marvel of simple engineering. Its handle might be made of bamboo, but its heart is the bundle of animal hairs that form the tip. The selection of these hairs was a science in itself. Different animals provided different qualities. Weasel hair offered spring and resilience, perfect for the sharp, angular strokes of regular script. Goat hair was much softer and more absorbent, ideal for the flowing, expressive lines of cursive calligraphy or the broad washes of ink painting. The most prized brushes often combined hairs of different textures and lengths in a single core, creating a tip that was both strong and sensitive. The brush's unique design, with its long, tapered point, gave the calligrapher an unparalleled range of expression. By varying the pressure, the angle, and the speed of the stroke, a single dip of the brush could produce a line that started as a hair-fine whisper, swelled into a thunderous, ink-high pool, and then tapered off to a delicate point. This was a world away from the fixed line width of a reed pen or the binary thick and thin of a quill. The brush could express the entire emotional state of the writer, their calm, their agitation, their joy, their restraint directly onto the paper. Using it required immense physical discipline and mental focus. The calligrapher had to hold the brush perfectly vertical, supporting its weight with the muscles of the arm and back, not just the fingers. Each stroke was a full-body commitment, fluid and irreversible. This tool, paired with the subtle, grindable ink stick, transformed writing from mere transcription into a high art form, a physical performance where the instrument was an extension of the artist's own energy and spirit. The contrast between these three tools could not be more striking. The Egyptian reed pen was a practical chisel for carving words onto papyrus. The European quill was a precise scalpel for dissecting meaning onto parchment with rhythmic contrast. And the Asian brush was a living extension of the soul, a conduit for capturing the very breath of an idea on silk or paper. Each one, in its own way, was a perfect key designed to unlock the potential of the remarkable inks they carried. But what about an ink that wasn't mixed in a pot or ground on a stone, but was instead taken directly from the sea? This brings us to one of history's most unusual and organic writing fluids, an innovation famously used by the Romans that came from a most unexpected source, the cuttlefish. The Romans, ever practical and resourceful, looked to the natural world for solutions, and in the depths of the Mediterranean, they found a creature that carried its own ink sac, a ready-made supply of a rich brown pigment. The cuttlefish, a clever cephalopod related to the squid and octopus, uses this ink as a defense mechanism. When threatened, it releases a dark, cloudy plume into the water to confuse predators and make a swift escape. For the Roman artisan or scribe, this wasn't just a biological curiosity. It was a pre-formulated ink, a gift from the ocean that required very little processing to be used. The primary pigment in this cephalopod ink is melanin, the same dark biological compound that gives color to human skin and hair. This melanin is suspended in a mucus solution, creating a substance that is naturally viscous, water-resistant, and possesses a unique warm brown hue. To harvest it, fishermen would catch cuttlefish and carefully remove the small, silvery ink sac located near the animal's gut. This sac was like a tiny, natural ink cartridge. The ink could then be extracted and used almost immediately. Sometimes it was simply diluted with a little water or mixed with a mild binder like gum or egg white to adjust its consistency, and improve its adhesion to parchment or papyrus. The result was a flowing, translucent brown ink that the Romans called sepia, named after the Greek word for the cuttlefish itself. This sepia ink was prized for its particular color and its working properties. It wasn't the stark, formal black of carbon or iron gall. It was a softer, more organic tone, reminiscent of earth and aged wood. Because of this, it found a special place in the world of art and informal writing. Roman artists used it for sketching and for creating the preliminary underdrawings for larger paintings and frescoes. Its fluid nature made it ideal for wash techniques, where diluted ink is brushed on to create soft shadows and gradients of tone. It was also used for writing, particularly in contexts where the severe authority of black ink was not required. Personal correspondence, draft manuscripts, and everyday record keeping might be done in this pleasant brown ink. Its use wasn't confined to Rome either. This knowledge spread through the ancient world, and evidence suggests that Greek and Minoan cultures before them also understood the value of this marine pigment. The connection between this ancient practice and our modern world is etched right into our language. The color we now call sepia, that familiar warm brown most often associated with antique photographs, draws its name directly from this historical ink. The toning process used in early photography, which gave black and white prints a more stable and aesthetically pleasing brownish tint, was named after the cuttlefish ink because the resulting color so closely matched the classic hue of the old Roman writing fluid. So when you look at an old, sepia-toned portrait from the 19th century, you are seeing a visual echo of a 2,000-year-old technology, a color born from the defensive cloud of a sea creature and harnessed by human ingenuity for the purpose of creation. It stands as a beautiful testament to the endless creativity of our ancestors, who saw potential not just in minerals and plants, but in the very life of the ocean, transforming a creature's instinct for survival into a medium for art and record. Following the age of exploration, as European ships returned from the Americas laden not just with gold and silver, but with strange new plants and woods, a quiet revolution began in the world of ink. European ink makers, who had relied for centuries on the classic, if sometimes destructive, formula of iron gall, suddenly had access to a whole new spectrum of colors extracted from the dense tropical forests of the New World. Two trees, in particular, would dramatically expand the artistic and scribble palette: logwood and Brazilwood, whose names are forever tied to the continents they came from and the vibrant hues they provided. From the swampy coasts of Central America and the Caribbean came the logwood tree, a seemingly unremarkable tree that held a secret in its heartwood. When cut, the deep red wood, if left exposed to air, would slowly darken to a rich, purplish black. Indigenous peoples of the region had long used it for dyeing textiles, but European dyers and ink makers quickly recognized its potential. The key was a chemical compound within the wood called hematoxylin. When logs were shipped to Europe, craftsmen would chop them into chips and shavings. To make a dye or an ink, these shavings were boiled in water, releasing the hematoxylin and creating a solution that was initially a reddish or orange-brown color. But the magic happened with the introduction of a mordant, a substance that fixes a dye. By adding a simple alkaline substance like wood ash or potash to the brew, the liquid would undergo a dramatic shift, transforming before one's eyes into a deep, intense purple black. This color was incredibly potent. A small amount of logwood could produce a vast quantity of dark dye, making it a highly economical alternative to other black pigments. For ink makers, This translated into a powerful new writing fluid. They would take this concentrated, color-shifted liquid and, just as with iron gall ink, add gum arabic as a binder to give it the right consistency for a quill pen. The resulting logwood ink flowed smoothly and dried to a handsome, dark purplish black that was initially very appealing. However, it had a significant weakness that iron gall ink did not. It was notoriously fugitive. Unlike the chemically permanent iron galatanate, logwood's color was an organic dye, susceptible to fading when exposed to light. A document written in logwood ink might look splendid when first penned, but over decades, the vibrant purple-black could slowly bleach to a dull, washed-out brown, compromising the permanence of the record. Because of this, it was never fully trusted for vital legal documents or priceless manuscripts, but it found a huge and important market in everyday commerce, for ledger entries, personal correspondence, and administrative paperwork where extreme longevity was not the primary concern. Its affordability and the sheer volume of ink it could produce made it the workhorse ink for the burgeoning bureaucracies and merchant classes of the 17th and 18th centuries. If logwood expanded the possibilities for black ink, then Brazil would utterly transform the world of red. This tree, found in the coastal forests of what is now Brazil, possessed a heartwood of such a brilliant, fiery red that it literally gave the country its name. Before the arrival of the Portuguese, the land was known by other terms, but the sheer economic value of this pau-brasil, or red wood like an ember, was so immense that it eventually christened the entire territory. The source of this stunning color is a compound called brazilin, similar to the hematoxylin in logwood, but yielding a completely different part of the spectrum. The process for extracting it was labor-intensive and contributed to the massive deforestation of the Brazilian coast. The trees were felled, the valuable heartwood was cut into logs, and these were shipped to Europe. There, artisans would grind the wood into a fine sawdust. This sawdust was then soaked and boiled, sometimes for days, to leach out the precious brazilin, creating a vat of intensely colored scarlet red liquid. Just like logwood, the final color could be manipulated with mordants. An alkaline mordant would push the color towards a deeper, more crimson red, while an acidic one could bring out brighter, more orangey tones. To turn this dye into a usable ink, the concentrated liquid was, again, mixed with gum arabic. The result was a vibrant, opaque red ink that took the European world by storm. Before Brazil would, the primary red ink available was vermilion, made from the toxic and expensive mineral cinnabar. Brazilwood ink provided a brilliant, organic, and relatively affordable alternative. It was eagerly adopted by scribes and illustrators for rubrication, the practice of writing headings, initial letters, and important passages in red to make them stand out from the black text. In illuminated manuscripts, though it couldn't rival the luxurious status of ultramarine blue, Brazilwood red became a staple for painting the robes of saints, highlighting decorative elements and adding dramatic flair to illustrations. Its vibrant hue can be seen in countless maps, charts, and documents from the age of exploration, a fitting testament to the global trade networks that brought it into being. The insatiable European demand for this red dye and ink was so great that it drove the exploitation of both the land and the indigenous people of Brazil, making Brazilwood one of the first major commodities in a colonial economic system that would reshape the world. The story of these two New World inks, therefore, is not just one of color chemistry. It is a story of globalization, of economic forces transforming artisanal practices, and of how the quest for a brighter palette on a page was intrinsically linked to the vast, and often destructive processes of discovery and colonization. Yet for all their practical chemistry, historical inks were never just tools for writing. They often dwelled in a fascinating shadow realm where the line between medicine, magic, and devotion blurred completely. Imagine a world where a substance as common as iron gall ink, resting in a pot on a scribe's desk, was also considered a potent remedy. Manuscripts from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance are filled with surprising references to ink, not just for penning cures, but as the cure itself. There are numerous accounts and recipe books that recommend a diluted spoonful of iron gall ink to treat a range of ailments. The logic, rooted in the humoral theory of medicine that dominated for centuries, saw this ink as a powerful astringent. Its high tannin content from the oak galls and its metallic, acidic nature were thought to have a drying, binding effect on the body. It was prescribed for conditions believed to be caused by an excess of moisture or phlegm, such as diarrhea, dysentery, or even to staunch internal bleeding. In a world without modern pharmacology, the intense, unpleasantly bitter taste and the dramatic visual transformation of the ink, from light brown to deep black, signaled a substance of undeniable potency, one that could theoretically counteract the body's imbalances. We even find records of scribes or monks literally licking their quills to moisten the tip, inadvertently consuming tiny amounts of ink, and perhaps reinforcing this belief in its everyday, benign utility. This practice reveals a world view where the physical and the metaphysical were intimately intertwined, where the same substance that recorded a prayer could also be swallowed as a physic. This belief in the inherent power of ink was amplified exponentially when the words it formed were not mundane records, but sacred texts or magical incantations. In this context, the ink became more than a medium. It was a conductor, a vessel for channeling spiritual force. For countless cultures, the written word itself was believed to hold a kind of life force. To write a holy name, a powerful verse from a sacred text, or a protective charm was to make that power physically present in the world. The ink was the blood that gave that power a body, fixing it onto a surface where it could act. This is why amulets, small scrolls of parchment or paper inscribed with specific phrases, were so common across different faiths and traditions. A verse from the Quran, a passage from the Psalms, or the names of angels might be carefully written in ink, folded, placed in a container, and worn on the body to ward off illness, the evil eye, or misfortune. The ink used in these contexts was often specially prepared, sometimes with added ingredients meant to enhance its spiritual efficacy. A scribe might mix holy water or water from a sacred spring into the ink instead of ordinary well water. They might add a pinch of consecrated salt or a drop of sacramental wine to the mixture, imbuing the very liquid with divine blessing before a single word was even formed. The most dramatic fusion of ink and magic, however, is found in the practice of creating and consuming holy ink. There are well-documented instances, particularly in Christian and Jewish mystical traditions, where the physical ink used to write a powerful prayer or a divine name was itself believed to become sanctified through the act of writing. In a remarkable ritual, a holy text would be meticulously inscribed onto a smooth, washable surface like a slate or a ceramic plate. Then the ink, now charged with the power of the words it spelled out, would be carefully washed off. This run-off water, now clouded with pigment and binder, was not discarded. It was collected and considered a potent spiritual medicine. The faithful would drink this inkai water, believing they were literally ingesting the divine power and protection contained within the sacred words. This was a direct, physical communion with the text, a way to internalize its blessing. The ink ceased to be a symbol and became the substance of the sacred itself. Similarly, in some folk magic traditions, a protective spell or a healing charm would be written onto an edible surface, like a thin wafer or an apple slice, with ordinary ink. The entire object would then be consumed, delivering the magic of the words directly into the body of the person seeking aid. In these practices, the separation between the message and the medium completely dissolved. The ink was the magic, and consuming it was the point of the ritual. This mystical dimension helps explain why the act of writing and the creation of books were so often surrounded by an aura of secrecy and reverence. The scribe or the magician was not merely a copyist. They were a wielder of powerful forces. They had to know the correct formulas, the right names of God or spirits to invoke, and the proper rituals for preparing their materials. A mistake in the writing could be more than just a cosmetic error. It could render a protective amulet useless or, worse, inadvertently invite malevolent forces. The ink pot was, in a very real sense, a cauldron of potential, and the quill was the wand that directed its energy. So the next time you see a dense, black line of iron gall ink on a medieval manuscript, consider that you might be looking at something that was once seen as a triple threat: a technological marvel for preserving knowledge, a potential cure for a stomach ailment, and a tangible fragment of a spell, all suspended in a single, timeless drop. For over 1,000 years, the written word in Europe had flowed from the steady, patient hand of a scribe, guided by a quill and the watery, acidic chemistry of iron gall ink. But in the middle of the 15th century, in a workshop in Mainz, Germany, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg was perfecting a machine that would shatter that ancient tradition and demand a brand new substance to bring it to life. The printing press, with its rows of reusable metal type, was a revolution in mechanics, but its success hinged entirely on a parallel revolution in chemistry. The ink that had served scribes so perfectly for centuries was utterly useless for this new technology. Imagine trying to print a book with the standard iron gall ink. It was thin and water-based, designed to be drawn from the capillary slit of a quill. If you tried to roll it onto a raised metal type, it would bead up and refuse to coat the surface evenly, like water on a waxed car. Then, when you pressed the type onto paper, the thin, runny liquid would spread and bleed, creating a blurry, smudged, and illegible mess. The crisp, sharp impression that was the whole point of movable type would have been impossible. Gutenberg's genius wasn't just in the press itself, but in his understanding that he needed an ink with entirely different physical properties. He needed an ink that was thick, tacky, and viscous. It had to be sticky enough to adhere to the metal type without dripping off, yet transfer cleanly and completely onto the paper under a swift, firm pressure. The solution he pioneered was the world's first oil-based printing ink, a formula that would become the lifeblood of the information age. Drawing on his background as a goldsmith, Gutenberg turned to the world of artists and their paints. For decades, Flemish painters had been experimenting with using oils, like linseed oil, as a binder for their pigments, creating paints that were richer, more vibrant, and slower drying than traditional egg-based tempera. Gutenberg saw the potential. His new ink would use this same principle. He took a dense, intensely black pigment, the same lampblack soot that Asian ink makers had prized for centuries, and he suspended it not in water or vinegar, but in a thick, processed linseed oil. The process of creating this oil vehicle was crucial. Raw linseed oil is slow-drying and can be sticky and uneven. Gutenberg and his successors would heat body the oil, cooking it carefully to thicken it and promote polymerization, a process where the oil's molecules begin to link together into longer chains. This created a varnish-like substance that was both tacky and strong. When the fine lampblack was ground into this cooked oil with immense patience, often for hours on a stone slab, it resulted in a thick, velvety, tar-like paste. This was the game changer. This oily ink could be applied with a leather-covered stuffed ball called a dauber. The printer would dab the ink onto the type, and its thick, glutinous nature meant it would coat the raised metal letters with a perfectly even, thin film, without filling the delicate spaces between them. Then, under the immense, even pressure of the screw press, this tacky ink would release from the metal and deposit itself with astonishing precision onto the waiting sheet of dampened paper, leaving a sharp, crisp, and brilliantly black impression. The ink itself didn't dry through absorption like iron gall ink. It dried through a slow chemical process of oxidation, as the linseed oil reacted with oxygen in the air to form a hard, durable film that was bonded to the paper. This meant the printed sheets had to be hung up to dry for some time, but the result was a page that was resistant to smudging and remarkably permanent. The contrast between the old scribble ink and the new printing ink could not be more profound, and it reveals the fundamental shift in how information was being produced. Iron gall ink was a tool for individual manual creation. Its properties were tailored to the rhythm of a single human hand, its flow and line variation a reflection of the scribe's personal touch. Gutenberg's oil-based ink, however, was a tool for mechanized reproduction. Its properties were dictated by the demands of metal, pressure, and standardization. It was designed for speed, uniformity, and the ability to create hundreds of identical copies from a single setting of type. This new ink was the essential partner to the press, the chemical key that unlocked the machine's revolutionary potential. Without it, Gutenberg's magnificent 42-line Bible would have been nothing more than a smeared and blurry curiosity. With it, he could produce texts of a clarity and consistency that no scribe could ever hope to match, launching a tsunami of printed material that would flood Europe, challenging the authority of the Church, empowering the scientific revolution, and forever changing the course of human history. The humble ink pot had been transformed from a scholar's companion into the fuel for an industrial revolution of the mind. So what was the exact alchemy behind this revolutionary new substance? The formula was deceptively simple in its ingredients, but achieving the perfect consistency was a secret art that separated a master printer from an amateur. The heart of the ink was lampblack, the same ancient form of carbon soot that the Egyptians and the Asian ink makers had used for millennia. This provided the essential, intensely black pigment that was both opaque and stable. But the soul of the ink, the component that made it work on a press, was linseed oil. This oil, pressed from the seeds of the flax plant, is thin and raw in its natural state, completely unsuitable for printing. The transformation began with a process known as boiling, though it was more accurately a careful, controlled heating. The raw linseed oil was poured into a large, heavy copper kettle and heated over a fire. This wasn't a rapid boil. It was a slow, patient cooking process that could last for hours. As the oil heated, it would begin to change. It would first become thinner, and then, as the printer watched it intently, it would start to thicken, undergoing a chemical transformation through oxidation and polymerization. The molecules in the oil would begin to link together into longer, more complex chains, turning the thin liquid into a thick, viscous, honey-like varnish. The skill was in knowing the exact moment to stop the cooking. If the oil was undercooked, It would be too thin and runny, bleeding on the type. If it was overcooked, it would become a sticky, tar-like gel that was impossible to work with, clogging the type and refusing to transfer to the paper. A master ink maker would test the viscosity by dipping a stick into the hot oil and observing how it dripped, the string test, where the drip needed to form a specific, long strand before breaking. Once this perfectly cooked varnish was ready and had cooled, the next stage was the mixing. The fine, fluffy lampblack was gradually added to the thick oil in precise proportions. This was not a job for the faint of heart or the clean of hand. It was a messy, physically demanding process of grinding and incorporation. The mixture of oil and carbon was placed on a large, flat stone slab and ground using a heavy, hand-held stone muller. The printer would lean their weight into the muller, pushing it in a circular motion, grinding the paste for hours. This wasn't just about mixing. It was about physically breaking down any clumps of pigment and ensuring every single particle of lampblack was perfectly and uniformly coated in the oily varnish. The goal was to achieve a silky, smooth, homogeneous paste with the consistency of thick black treacle. When a small amount was rolled between the fingers, it should feel perfectly smooth without a single grain of grittiness. This final ink was then stored in a bladder, often a pig's bladder. When it was time to print, the printer would prick the bladder with a pin and squeeze out the thick ink onto his inking ball, ready to dab it onto the waiting type. This oil-based formula, born in Gutenberg's workshop, was so perfectly suited to its task that it became the standard for printing for the next 400 years. While minor adjustments were made, sometimes adding resins like frankincense to speed drying or using other oils like walnut oil, the fundamental chemistry of carbon pigment suspended in a heat-bodied oil remained completely dominant until the advent of synthetic chemicals and industrial production in the 19th century. It was this durable, tacky, brilliantly black ink that truly made the printed word possible, laying down the physical foundation for every book, pamphlet, and newspaper that would spread new ideas, challenge old powers, and accelerate human progress at a pace the world had never before seen. But for every word proudly displayed in stark black ink on a public document, there existed another world of writing, a hidden world of messages meant to be seen only by a select few, and then to vanish without a trace. This is the shadowy history of invisible ink, a tool of spies, lovers, and revolutionaries that adds a thrilling layer of intrigue to our story. The simplest of these secret inks are hiding in plain sight, in your own kitchen. The method is almost childishly simple. Take the juice of a lemon or some milk, or even the liquid from a boiled onion, and use it as your ink. Write your message with a clean pen on a blank piece of paper. As it dries, the writing will seemingly disappear, leaving behind a perfectly ordinary, innocent-looking sheet. The secret lies not in the writing, but in the reading. When the recipient gently heats the paper by holding it close to a candle flame, carefully ironing it, or even placing it near a warm light bulb, the hidden message begins to materialize. The organic compounds in these household substances, rich in carbon, caramelize and oxidize at a lower temperature than the paper itself. They turn a light brown, revealing the treachery or the secret affection word by word. This wasn't just a parlor trick. It was a genuine tool of clandestine communication. There are accounts of ancient Greek spies using their own urine, which contains urea and other organic compounds that darken with heat, to send hidden reports. The Roman poet Pliny the Elder even wrote about using the milk of the thymomalus plant for secret writing, a message that could be revealed by sprinkling the page with powdered charcoal. which would adhere only to the residual, sticky organic residue. For centuries, this simple chemistry of heat and organic decay provided a fragile but effective method for sending information under the very noses of enemies or censors. But as the stakes of espionage grew higher, so too did the sophistication of the inks. By the time of the American Revolution, both British and American intelligence networks were engaged in a sophisticated chemical arms race, developing what were known as sympathetic inks. These were not simple organic juices. They were complex chemical solutions that required a very specific reagent, a developer, to be revealed. A spy might write an innocent, mundane letter to a relative, but between the lines, or perhaps on the reverse side treated with a special chemical, he would inscribe his true report using one of these invisible inks. The developer was the key that unlocked the secret, and only the intended recipient would know what it was. A message written in a lead acetate solution would remain perfectly invisible until it was exposed to the vapor of sulfurated hydrogen, which would cause it to turn a dark, visible brown. An ink made from copper sulfate would reveal itself only when the paper was brushed with a solution of ammonia, producing a deep blue color. The British Intelligence Service, run by men like Major John Andre, became particularly adept at this, creating elaborate codes and pairing them with specific sympathetic inks to coordinate with loyalist sympathizers. On the American side, General George Washington was a fervent supporter of invisible ink technology, recognizing its vital importance to the war effort. His chief intelligence officer, a clever man named Benjamin Talmadge, set up the Culper spy ring in New York and Long Island. One of their most famous agents, a woman named Anna Strong, is believed to have used a form of secret ink to communicate the location of hidden messages. She would hang a black petticoat on her clothesline alongside a specific number of handkerchiefs, signaling to the other spies where a message was concealed. The ink itself, supplied by Washington's own scientific advisor, was a sophisticated formula, possibly based on ferrous sulfate. The invisible writing would be placed within the text of a seemingly ordinary business letter or a social note. To reveal the hidden text, the recipient would have to paint over the entire page with a specific developer chemical, another compound that would react with the invisible iron salts to form a visible pigment. This two-step process, a specific ink paired with a specific developer, made the messages far more secure than those that could be revealed by simple heat, which any suspicious censor might think to try. The ultimate evolution of this secret science aimed to make the message not just invisible, but completely undetectable. The fear was that even if an enemy couldn't raid your invisible ink, they might still be able to detect its presence. A particularly vigilant guard might notice a slight gloss on the paper from a gum binder, or feel a subtle stiffness in the fibers where the secret writing had dried. To counter this, the most advanced spycraft involved methods to erase the very evidence of writing. One ingenious technique involved writing the true message in a normal, visible ink, but then covering it completely with an innocent, overwritten text. To the casual observer, it was just a simple letter. But when the recipient soaked the paper in a specific chemical reagent, the overwritten text would dissolve away, leaving the original, secret message perfectly intact underneath. This was the art of steganography, the art of concealing the very existence of the message itself. It represents the highest level of the spy's craft, where the medium isn't just a hidden text, but a complete deception. The history of invisible ink, therefore, is a mirror to the history of conflict and power. It shows us that while public ink was used to build empires and declare laws in the open, this secret ink was the lifeblood of the underground, the whispered conversation that happened in the shadows, shaping the outcomes of wars and the fates of nations through words that were never meant to be seen. Yet for all the power of Gutenberg's press, the fundamental palette of inks had remained locked in a natural world of soot, oak galls, and rare minerals for centuries. That entire reality was about to be shattered in a single, explosive instant of discovery. An accident in a London laboratory that would unleash a riot of color onto the printed page and transform ink from an artisanal craft into a pillar of industrial might. The spark for this revolution wasn't a new printing press, but a quest for a malaria cure. In 1856, an 18-year-old chemistry student named William Henry Perkin was toiling in a makeshift lab during the Easter break, attempting to synthesize quinine from coal tar, a sticky, black byproduct of the gas lighting industry that was piling up as a troublesome waste. His experiment failed miserably. Instead of the clear, curative quinine he hoped for, he was left with a dark, unappealing sludge. But as he was cleaning his glassware with alcohol, something miraculous happened. The sludge dissolved, and the solution turned a brilliant, intense purple, a color so vibrant and rich it seemed to glow from within. Most chemists would have dismissed this as a failed result, but Perkin, with a visionary's eye, recognized he had stumbled upon something far more valuable than an artificial medicine. He had discovered the world's first synthetic organic dye, which he named Movine. This was the birth of the aniline dye industry, named for the aniline oil derived from coal tar. Perkin, showing incredible entrepreneurial spirit for a teenager, quickly patented his process, quit his studies, and with his family's backing, built a factory to mass produce his mauve. The timing was perfect. Before Movine, such a vivid purple was exorbitantly expensive, derived from the mucus of a rare sea snail or from certain lichens. Suddenly, thanks to a waste product of the industrial city, this regal color became cheap and available to everyone. The fashion world went wild. Queen Victoria wore a Movine-dyed silk gown to the Royal Exhibition of 1862, cementing its status, and soon the mauve measles swept through high society. But the impact on ink was even more profound. For the first time in human history, color was no longer tied to the slow, uncertain harvest of plants, minerals, or animals. It could be engineered in a vat with precise chemical formulas and produced on an immense industrial scale. Ink makers, who had relied for centuries on logwood for black and Brazil wood for red, now had a whole new universe of colors at their disposal. Aniline inks in dazzling shades of magenta, brilliant green, and electric blue began to flood the market. These new inks were incredibly potent, requiring only a tiny amount of dye to produce an intensely saturated color, making them far more economical than their natural predecessors. They flowed beautifully from the new, high-speed rotary printing presses that were coming to dominate newspaper and magazine publishing. The era of the full-color advertisement, the illustrated magazine cover, and the vibrant poster had arrived, fueling a new visual culture of consumerism and mass media. This chemical revolution was perfectly synchronized with a mechanical one. The 19th century saw the rise of newspapers as the primary source of information for a rapidly growing and newly literate urban public. To feed this demand, printing technology had to evolve from the slow, platen-based presses of Gutenberg's day to the roaring, steam-powered rotary presses that could churn out tens of thousands of pages per hour. These machines were marvels of engineering, with massive cylinders spinning at high speed, but they placed incredible new demands on ink. The old oil-based inks that worked for slow, flatbed presses were too tacky and slow-drying. They would smudge and blur on the high-speed rollers, and would never dry in time on the continuous reels of cheap wood pulp paper. The printing industry needed a new kind of ink, one that was thin, fast-drying, and could be produced in vast quantities. The solution was a shift in chemistry, creating what are known as hot type or news inks. These inks retained carbon black as their pigment for a sharp, readable black, but they replaced the slow-drying, heat-bodied linseed oil with much thinner mineral oils, derived from the burgeoning petroleum industry. These mineral oils were prized for their ability to be absorbed rapidly into the porous newsprint. The ink would literally vanish into the paper fibers almost on contact, allowing the freshly printed sheets to be folded and bundled within minutes, a critical requirement for daily journalism. To achieve this on an industrial scale, massive ink factories emerged, filled with enormous mixing vats and powerful grinding machines that could produce thousands of gallons of ink per day. The process was no longer a patient grinding on a stone slab. It was a deafening industrial operation of steel rollers and hydraulic presses, transforming raw materials into a river of ink that was shipped in barrels to newspaper offices around the world. The iconic image of the newspaper boy on a street corner, hawking the latest edition with headlines still wet to the touch, was made possible by this specific marriage of petroleum chemistry and high-speed machinery. It was an ink designed for the relentless, urgent pace of modern life. Beyond the black and white of the daily news, the explosion of synthetic dyes also created a booming new market for colored printing inks, which in turn gave rise to an entirely new profession, the ink chemist. These were the industrial alchemists, men and women who worked in laboratory-like settings within the great ink factories, armed with beakers, spectrometers, and precise scales. Their job was no longer to follow ancient handwritten recipes, but to engineer custom inks for specific purposes. They had to understand the complex interactions between the new aniline dyes, various binding vehicles like resins and oils, and the different types of paper and printing processes. A chemist formulating an ink for a glossy magazine cover needed a hard, quick-setting resin that would dry to a shiny, smear-proof finish. Another, working on a cheap paper bag, needed a cheap, simple ink that would absorb quickly without bleeding. The chemist became the bridge between the art of printing and the science of chemistry, constantly tweaking formulas to improve color fastness, prevent clogging of delicate type, and ensure the ink behaved predictably on a press running at top speed. This professionalization signaled a complete break from the past. The medieval monk gathering oak galls and the 19th century chemist synthesizing a new magenta dye in a lab were both masters of their craft, but they inhabited different worlds. One worked within the rhythms of the natural world and the scriptorium's quiet discipline. The other operated in the heart of the industrial machine, optimizing for speed, cost, and volume. The ink chemist's work made possible the vibrant chromolithographs that adorned parlors, the colorful labels that sold new branded products, and the detailed maps that guided explorers and empires. They turned color from a rare luxury into an everyday expectation, embedding it into the very fabric of visual communication, and forever changing how we see the printed word and image. So how can we possibly know all of this? How can we be so certain about the exact recipes used by a medieval monk or an Egyptian scribe when their workshop manuals have long since turned to dust? The answer lies not in dusty old texts alone, but in a remarkable fusion of history and cutting-edge science, where physicists and chemists have become detectives, using tools that feel like they're straight out of science fiction to read the secrets hidden within the ink itself. For centuries, The only way to understand an ancient document's composition was through destructive testing, taking a tiny, precious scraping of ink or parchment and dissolving it in chemicals to analyze its components. This was the equivalent of performing an autopsy. You might learn the cause of death, but you would irrevocably damage the patient. Today, a technological revolution has given conservators a suite of non-invasive instruments that allow them to analyze these priceless artifacts without ever touching them with a scalpel, peering right through the surface to uncover a hidden world of chemistry and lost history. Two of the most powerful of these tools are X-ray fluorescence and Raman spectroscopy, and the way they work is nothing short of magical. Let's start with X-ray fluorescence, or XRF. Imagine you could hold a futuristic scanner up to an ancient manuscript and, with a simple click, get a readout of its elemental composition, as if the ink itself were whispering its ingredients to you. That's essentially what an XRF analyzer does. Here's the basic principle: every chemical element has a unique atomic structure. When you bombard a sample with high-energy X-rays, those X-rays knock electrons loose from the inner shells of the atoms in the material. This makes the atom unstable, and to return to balance, an electron from an outer shell drops in to fill the vacancy. When that happens, it releases a tiny, specific amount of energy in the form of a secondary X-ray, a unique fluorescent signature that is like a fingerprint for that particular element. The XRF detector captures these signals and instantly displays a spectrum, showing peaks for iron, copper, lead, mercury, or calcium. For an ink researcher, this is transformative. By pointing the handheld XRF gun at a dark black line of writing, they can immediately confirm the presence of iron, definitively identifying it as an iron Gall ink. They can see if there are traces of copper, which might indicate a particular mineral source for the green vitriol, or even detect zinc, which could be a sign of a later restoration. They can then move the scanner to a bright red initial letter and see a massive peak for mercury, confirming the use of vermilion, or a peak for lead, pointing to the use of red lead pigment. This technology doesn't just confirm what we suspect, it can also reveal profound surprises. For instance, analyzing some early medieval manuscripts, scientists have sometimes found inks with high levels of copper and little to no iron, suggesting the use of a now obscure copper Gall ink recipe that was lost to history. XRF gives us the elemental map, telling us what atoms are present, and in doing so, it provides the first crucial clues to understanding the scribe's material world. But knowing the elements is only half the story. It's like knowing a cake contains flour, eggs, and sugar, but not knowing if it's a sponge cake or a pound cake. This is where Raman spectroscopy comes in, a technique that reveals the molecular fingerprint of a substance. While XRF tells us what atoms are there, Raman tells us how those atoms are bonded together into specific molecules and compounds. The process involves shining a very focused, single wavelength laser, often a visible green or red light, onto a tiny spot on the manuscript, smaller than the period at the end of this sentence. Most of this laser light simply bounces back, but a tiny fraction of it, about 1 in 10 million photons, interacts with the chemical bonds in the material, causing them to vibrate and scatter the light at a slightly different energy. This minute shift in energy, known as the Raman shift, is meticulously measured by a powerful spectrometer. Crucially, every different molecular compound, carbon black, iron galatanate, vermilion, lapis lazuli, has its own unique and predictable Raman scattering signature. It's as if each molecule sings its own distinctive note when the laser light hits it. This allows scientists to make incredibly precise identifications. They can distinguish between different crystalline forms of carbon, confirming that a black ink is indeed lamp black. They can pinpoint the specific molecular signature of ultramarine blue, differentiating it from other, cheaper blue pigments like azurite that a scribe might have used as a substitute. Perhaps most importantly, Raman spectroscopy is brilliant at identifying organic compounds, which are often invisible to XRF. It can detect the specific vibrational modes of gum arabic, the animal glue in Asian ink sticks, or the binding media in paints. This means we're not just learning about the pigment, we're learning about the complete ink recipe, the very glue that held history together. The true power of these techniques is revealed not when they are used alone, but when they are combined, building a complete chemical portrait of an artifact that was once thought to be a silent, two-dimensional object. Nowhere is this detective work more dramatic than in the study of palimpsests' manuscripts that are literal layers of history. The word palimpsest comes from the Greek for scraped again. In a time when parchment was incredibly expensive and labor-intensive to produce, it was common practice to take an older, seemingly obsolete manuscript, scrape or wash away the original text, and reuse the pages for a new work. To the naked eye, the original writing was gone, erased from history. For centuries, these foundational texts remained hidden, their wisdom silenced beneath more recent words. But modern science has given these ghosts a voice. Multispectral imaging is often the first key. By photographing a palimpsest under different wavelengths of light, from ultraviolet to infrared, and using sophisticated software to combine the images, researchers can dramatically enhance the contrast between the faded, underlying ink and the parchment. The carbon-based inks of the original text, for example, absorb infrared light and appear black, while the parchment reflects it, making the vanished words suddenly leap from the page as if they were written yesterday. But sometimes the erasure was too thorough, and even multispectral imaging isn't enough. This is where techniques like XRF prove their worth in an unexpected way. Imagine a parchment that was originally used for a Greek scientific treatise written in a carbon-based ink. Later, a medieval monk scrubbed it clean and overwrote it with a religious text in an iron gall ink. The carbon from the original writing, being chemically inert, often remains embedded in the parchment fibers, even if it's invisible. An XRF scan of a page from this palimpsest will show a uniform presence of iron from the new visible text. But if the scientist carefully maps the entire page, they might also detect other elements that have no business being in a standard medieval ink. They might find traces of lead or copper that correspond exactly to the shapes of the invisible, underlying Greek letters. These elements could have come from the water used by the original scribe, from impurities in his ink, or from a pigment used for rubrics. The XRF map, in essence, draws a ghostly elemental outline of the lost text, allowing scholars to begin the painstaking process of reconstruction. The most famous example of this is the Archimedes palimpsest, a 10th century copy of works by the great Greek mathematician was erased in the 13th century and turned into a prayer book. For 700 years, Archimedes' groundbreaking theories on infinity and geometry were considered lost. Then, in the early 20th century, it was identified as a palimpsest, and a monumental, multi-year scientific campaign began. Using a breathtaking combination of multispectral imaging, XRF to map traces of iron from the original ink, and other advanced techniques, researchers were able to recover the priceless text, revealing Archimedes' mind in a way that hadn't been possible for a millennium. This isn't just about reading old words. It's about recovering foundational ideas that have shaped our modern world. Every time a scientist points a laser or an X-ray beam at a palimpsest, they are not just analyzing chemistry, they are performing an act of historical resurrection, pulling entire worlds of thought back from the brink of oblivion. Recreating these ancient recipes today is far more than a simple chemistry experiment. It's a form of hands-on archaeology, a way to bridge the centuries by getting our own hands stained with the past. Across the globe, a dedicated community of historians, master calligraphers, and curious crafters are stepping back into the workshop, armed with little more than medieval instruction manuals and a determination to get it right. But following a 900-year-old recipe is not as straightforward as it seems. The first major hurdle is sourcing the ingredients with the same authenticity a medieval monk would have had. You can't just order oak galls online from a random supplier and expect the same result. A modern practitioner will spend weekends walking through old-growth forests, searching for the perfect oak trees and examining their branches for those distinctive marble-like growths. They learn to identify the exit holes left by the mature wasp, a sign that the gall is ripe and full of tannic acid. They seek out specific species of oak, knowing that an English oak might produce a slightly different ink than a Hungarian or an Aleppo oak. This intimate engagement with the landscape is the first lesson. It connects the ink maker to the seasonal rhythms and local resources that dictated a scribe's work. Once the galls are gathered, the next challenge is the iron. A modern chemist might simply purchase a jar of pure iron sulfate from a laboratory supply company, but that misses the point entirely. To truly understand the process, many recreators seek out historical sources. They hunt for rusty iron nails at flea markets, or even attempt to make their own green vitriol by leaving iron in vinegar for weeks, and then evaporating the liquid to harvest the crystalline salts, just as a medieval apothecary would have done. This messy, unpredictable work immediately reveals the variables that an ancient recipe takes for granted. The purity of the iron, the acidity of the vinegar, the temperature of the room, all of these factors can dramatically alter the final product. When the moment of truth arrives and the tannin-rich gall tea is mixed with the iron solution, the modern ink maker experiences the same thrill of alchemy that a scribe would have felt. Seeing the clear brown liquid instantly deepen into a purplish black is a moment of pure magic, a direct connection to the chemical intuition of the past. Yet achieving that beautiful color is only the beginning. The real test comes when the ink is put to the page. Many first-time recreators are dismayed to find their carefully crafted iron gall ink going down a pale, watery gray, refusing to darken to that classic, authoritative black. This is where the subtle, unwritten knowledge of the craft becomes apparent. The recipes in the old books don't mention that the ink needs time to oxidize, or that the pH of the water can affect the reaction. Through repeated trial and error, modern experimenters have rediscovered these lost nuances. They learn that letting the ink mature for a few days in an open jar allows it to develop its full color potential. They find that the type of binder is crucial. Gum arabic gives a beautiful gloss and flow, but too much can make the ink gummy and prone to flaking. They discover that writing on properly prepared parchment, which has a slightly rough, absorbent surface, yields a far better result than modern, smooth paper. Each failed batch, each smudged line or corroded nib, is a lesson in the immense skill possessed by historical scribes. These were not merely following a recipe, they were masters of a complex, living material, adjusting their methods based on the humidity in the scriptorium, the quality of that year's Gall harvest, and the feel of the parchment under their hand. The modern recreator gains a profound respect for this embodied knowledge, the kind that can only be learned through doing, not just reading. This experimental approach has also solved long-standing historical puzzles. For decades, scholars debated certain cryptic instructions in medieval manuscripts, such as adding things like wine, rainwater, or even pomegranate rinds to the ink. By actually trying these variations, modern craftspeople have uncovered the practical reasons behind them. Adding white wine, for instance, introduces extra acids that help extract more tannin from the galls, resulting in a darker, more potent ink. Rainwater, being naturally soft and free of the minerals found in well water, prevents unwanted chemical reactions that could cause the pigment to precipitate out of solution. The pomegranate rinds, it turns out, contain additional tannins that can supplement a weak batch of gall solution. These are not superstitious additions. They are empirical fixes developed over generations of hands-on experimentation. When a modern calligrapher dips a hand-cut goose quill into their homemade iron gall ink and lays down a crisp, dark line on a piece of parchment, they are participating in a tradition that stretches back 1,000 years. They feel the slight spring of the quill, hear the soft scratch as it moves across the surface, and see the ink slowly darken over the following hours. This sensory experience provides an insight no written document ever could. It reveals the physical rhythm of the scribe's work, the patience required, and the deep personal connection between the maker, the material, and the sacred or scholarly act of writing itself. We begin to understand that every illuminated manuscript, every legal charter, every personal letter from the past is not just a vehicle for text. It is a physical artifact, a testament to a human being's skill in transforming the raw, wild stuff of the earth oak trees, iron, and water into a medium for thought, for faith, and for memory. And so, we have traveled from the banks of the Nile to the heart of the digital age, all following the flow of a single, transformative substance. It is a legacy etched not just in parchment, but in the very structure of our modern world. Consider the sheer arc of this journey. It began with the elemental simplicity of soot and gum, a formula so perfect it allowed the thoughts of the pharaohs to speak across 40 centuries. Then came the alchemical genius of iron and oak galls, an ink that bound the legal and literary foundations of Europe with a permanence so powerful it could, paradoxically, consume the very pages it sought to immortalize. We witnessed the meditative art of the Asian ink stick, where the act of creation began with the calming rhythm of grinding, transforming carbon and animal, glue into the breath of calligraphy and painting. Each of these inks was a direct reflection of its environment, a product of the local landscape, the acacia trees of Egypt, the oak forests of Europe, the pine soot of Asia. They were technologies born of place, yet they enabled ideas to travel far beyond their origins. The great library of Alexandria, the scriptoria of medieval monasteries, the printing houses of Renaissance Europe, these were all cathedrals of knowledge built upon the humble foundation of ink. It was the indispensable partner to every great human endeavor, the quiet witness to the signing of treaties, the composing of symphonies, the drafting of declarations of rights, and the mapping of unknown continents. Every leap in our collective understanding, from the scientific revolution to the Enlightenment, was inked onto paper before it could take root in the human mind. This substance was the physical network upon which civilization itself was built, long before the existence of digital networks. And now we find ourselves in an era where the physicality of ink seems to be receding. We write on screens that glow with pixels, not pigment. We type on keyboards, our words appearing as light, not as a stain upon a surface. It would be easy to see this as the end of ink's story, a final obsolescence in the face of a superior technology. But that would be a profound misunderstanding. The digital world we inhabit is not the antithesis of ink. It is its direct descendant, its logical and most powerful evolution. Think about the language we still use. We bookmark a web page. We talk about a website's homepage. We use fonts that are digital recreations of typefaces originally carved from metal or drawn with a quill. The very concept of a document on your computer with its pages and margins is a direct metaphor borrowed from the world of physical ink and paper. Our screens are simply a new kind of parchment, infinitely malleable and instantly distributable. The ink has become pure information binary code, streams of electrons orchestrating the dance of colored light. Yet the fundamental human impulse remains identical: to record, to communicate, to preserve a thought, and send it out into the world. The illuminated manuscript of the medieval monk and the meticulously designed website of a modern artist serve the same core purpose. They are both vessels for human expression, designed to convey meaning and beauty to an audience. The digital revolution did not erase our need for the written word. It supercharged it, granting our ink a velocity and a reach that Gutenberg himself could never have conceived. This continuity reveals the true, enduring legacy of ink. It was never really about the specific chemistry of carbon or iron galatanate. It was always about the idea of a permanent mark. Ink is the technology of externalized memory. It is what allows us to offload our thoughts from the fragile, ephemeral vessel of our own minds and place them into a shared, stable space where others can see them, challenge them, and build upon them. The ancient Egyptian scribe who recorded grain stores on a papyrus scroll was participating in the same fundamental act as a modern scientist who publishes a groundbreaking paper in a digital journal. Both are creating a public record, a fixed point of reference that allows for collective action and cumulative knowledge. Ink, in all its forms, broke the tyranny of time and distance that governed oral tradition. It created a bridge between generations, allowing Aristotle to teach Newton and Newton to teach Einstein. This is the engine that ink has powered for 5,000 years, the relentless, accelerating accumulation of human understanding. Our screens have simply made the engine run faster and more efficiently. The cloud servers that store our collective digital knowledge are the modern equivalent of the great libraries of antiquity, but with one crucial difference: their contents are not locked away in a single physical location, vulnerable to fire or decay. They are distributed, copied, and backed up across the globe, creating a form of preservation that is, in many ways, more resilient than stone or parchment. So, the next time you pick up a pen to sign a document, or even when you tap out a message on your phone, take a moment to feel the weight of that history in your hand. You are participating in a chain of innovation that stretches back to the first human who mixed charcoal with water and made a deliberate mark on a cave wall. You are wielding the power that recorded the laws of Hammurabi, that painted the Sistine Chapel, that printed the Gutenberg Bible, and that now pulses through the fiber optic cables connecting our planet. From the soot of an oil lamp to the light of an LED screen, the essence remains unchanged. We are a species driven to mark our presence, to tell our stories, and to send our knowledge forward in the future. Ink, in its beautiful myriad forms, has been the constant and indispensable medium for that grand human project. It is the fluid of history, and its story is, in the end, our own. What an incredible journey we've taken through the history of ink. From the carbon black scraped from Egyptian oil lamps to the iron and oak galls that powered European scriptoria. From the radiant ultramarine born in Afghan mines to the secret sepia of the cuttlefish, we've seen that ink was never just one thing. It was a global phenomenon, a testament to human resourcefulness, crafted from the most surprising ingredients the local world could provide. It was chemistry and alchemy, art and devotion, all mixed together in a pot. Every culture in every era looked at the materials around them, the soot from their fires, the galls on their oak trees, the minerals in their earth, even the ink sacs of creatures from the sea, and asked the same brilliant question: how can I use this to make my mark? How can I use this to make my thoughts last? This relentless curiosity is the true story of ink. It's not just a history of recipes, but a history of the human mind itself, constantly experimenting, adapting, and striving to bridge the gap between a fleeting idea and a permanent record. Every time we uncover another ancient formula, we're not just learning how to make a color. We're learning how a different civilization saw the world and sought to understand their place within it. So the next time you see an old document, a faded manuscript, or even just a line of writing in a book, I hope you'll look a little closer. Remember that you're not just looking at words. You're looking at the physical evidence of a moment of creation, a drop of ink that contains within it a whole story of human ingenuity, patience, and the unquenchable desire to speak across the centuries. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other incredible stories are waiting to be told? What other historical mysteries are just begging to be unraveled? I'd love to hear what you think. What fascinating piece of the past, what forgotten technology or unsolved enigma would you want to see us explore together next? Let me know your ideas.